Good morning. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. God, we need your guidance as we study the scriptures, not just that we might understand them, but we might know how to live in response to them. What it means to love you with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourself. We ask your blessing on what we do here today. In Christ's name, amen. Well, we are finishing the 14th chapter of the book of Revelation, past what I think is the most difficult set of verses maybe in the whole New Testament, if not the whole Bible, verses 9 through 11 of chapter 14, and on to the end of 14, where there are two visions that appear at the end of chapter 14. So we begin at 14:14. I'm using the New American Standard Version today, so it may differ slightly from what you have. John says there, "And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man." That title, Son of Man, means one that looked like a human being. It comes from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, where Daniel sees coming on the clouds of heaven one who looked like a human being, like a person. And the Aramaic way of saying that, the Hebrew way of saying that, is a son of man. That phrase occurs other places in the Old Testament. In Psalm 8, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him?" Son of man is clearly in apposition to or in poetic parallelism, I should say, to the word for human being or man. And then in the book of Ezekiel, when God addresses Ezekiel, he often addresses him as Son of Man. It's another way of saying, "Hey, you, person, you out over there, Son of Man." So it means a human being, but it became, on the lips of Jesus, the most frequent self-identification, self-reference that Jesus used about himself. He was reluctant to be called the Christ or the Messiah because he came to be a different kind of Messiah than people were expecting. He came to be a suffering servant and to give his life as a ransom for many, as he said in Mark 10:45. So he was reluctant to use those titles. Son of God came to be used for him pretty much after the resurrection. Even though it's prominent in the Gospel of John, in my view, the Gospel of John is written from a thoroughly post-resurrection point of view and treats Jesus as the risen Son of God throughout the whole Gospel of John. But Son of Man, in the Synoptic Gospels especially, was Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself. And here we've noted earlier that this title earlier in Revelation was used of Jesus. So here we've got of the risen Christ. So here we have one like a son of man, having come on a cloud, just like Daniel 7:13, with a crown of victory on his head, and a sharp sickle or sword in his hand. The Greek word here is normal word for sword, but it's likely to be a sharp, hooked shape, curved blade for threshing out grain, for cutting grain, or you might think of cutting vegetation of some kind out with a sickle. We used to have one in the barn when I was growing up in rural Michigan. There was a sickle there, and I don't recall having used it or seeing my parents use it, but maybe my father used it to cut down the corn stalks in our garden at the end of the growing season. That could be. Anyway, the Son of Man has a sharp sickle in his hand, and another angel. We're going to see a lot of angels, and John basically just says allos angelos, which is Greek for another angel. And he doesn't identify them by name or who they are or number them or whatever. He just keeps calling them another angel. And they're going to see a lot of another angels here. So this first another angel came out of the temple in heaven, which we've, of course, been seeing as a part of the throne room scene that we've been in since chapter 5, maybe even chapter 4. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven and cried out with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, that is, to the Son of Man, and says to him, "Put in your sickle and reap, because the hour to reap," or to harvest, "has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe," or is ready. And he who sat on the cloud did swing his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested, or reaped. So this harvest is, I think, and it agrees, my view agrees with a couple of the commentaries that I'm using, that this is a positive harvest. This is the final harvest of all the saints, of all the believers, that the Son of Man is harvesting all who belong to him, and does so, and with regard to the whole earth, not just regard to the Roman Empire or Palestine, but with regard to the whole earth. The Son of Man is harvesting to himself and to God's kingdom all those who belong to him. So I see this first harvest as a positive one. But clearly the second harvest is not so. And verse 17, "And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and also had a sharp sickle. And another angel," here's another angel, "and another angel, the one who had power over fire," which usually symbolizes divine judgment. So our expectations are raised that this is maybe not going to be a positive outcome or a positive event. "And another angel," this is verse 18, "the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar," that is, from the altar that is in the temple or the tent of witness or the tent of meeting in heaven, in John's vision or picture of this. Again, symbolic, not intended to be taken literally, but symbolic of the divine presence in heaven. And the angel comes out from the altar and calls out in a loud voice to this second angel, this other angel who has a sharp sickle, saying, "Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters," the bunches of grapes, "from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe." Now, what we've seen so far, except for that mention of fire, it could be positive, but this harvest is clearly not going to be, given what follows. And 19, "And the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth." And here's where we have the proof that this is not a positive harvest, "and threw them into the winepress of the wrath of God." So I don't know if you've ever seen a wine press. We used to live in Oregon before we moved to Washington, and we lived right in the middle of wine country, and you could go to any number of vineyards in our immediate area. Within 5 miles easily there were multiple vineyards, and at harvest season, at the right time, they cut the clusters of grapes, threw them into a wine press, and that wine press, sometimes they even hired college students from the college I worked at to trample the grapes so that the juice of the grape would flow out of the wine press into prepared containers for the juice that was flowing out of the wine press. And here they throw these clusters of grapes harvested from the earth with the sickle of the other angel, and it is called the winepress of the wrath of God. So this is not a positive harvest. and the winepress was trodden outside the city. So this winepress isn't inside the holy city, it's outside. And everyone, I think, thinks that this is a reference to the fact that Jesus was crucified outside the city. So now God's wrath is getting back at those who crucified the Son of God outside the city and shed his blood outside the city. And so here, this winepress outside the city is being trodden, and blood comes out of the winepress. The juice of the grapes is likened to blood, and it was a lot. I think we can say it was a lot. It was as high as the juice, or the blood was as high as the bridle of a horse, for a distance of 200 miles, which the Greek actually says something about a number of stadia. Let's see if I can find that. Hang on a minute, it's here someplace. Well, I'm not, oh yes, 200 miles is the equivalent of 1,600 stadia, which is what the Greek text actually says. There are variations in the Greek text, but the most reliable one says 1,600 stadia, which is about 200 miles. So you can imagine that's a lot of blood. And you can also imagine that it's symbolic. It's a metaphor for the wrath of God against those who have rejected God and sided with the beast and the dragon, both beasts and the dragon, against God and God's rule, and are insisting on the worship of other gods and of the Roman Empire in particular. So that's where chapter 14 ends, with two visions, two harvests, one positive, sweeping out of the world those who belong to God. If you want to call that a rapture, you can call that a rapture, but it's not a rapture before the tribulation. It's at the end of the tribulation. And God rescues out of the world those who belong to him. And the next harvest, it's a harvest of divine wrath or judgment. So says John. Chapter 15 then, which I also sent you study questions for, is not very long. It's only 8 verses long, and it won't take us long, I think, to get through it. It's pretty straightforward. So John likes to begin in Revelation, to begin new scenes with the words, "And I saw another," and so this "and I saw" starts a new scene. In fact, chapters 15 through, I think it's nearly the end of the chapter, near the end of the book, starts another whole section in which we are going to see 7 plagues which parallel the seven trumpets, which we've already seen, and the 7 seals that we saw before that. It is very likely that this repetition of 7 events of judgment are meant to be the same set of 7 repeated 3 times for emphasis, rather than 21 separate events in a chronological sequence. Revelation can't really be read that way. There's so much repetition. In fact, this treading out of the winepress of the wrath of God occurs later on in the book, and the Son of Man does it. We've already heard that Babylon has fallen, and that also occurs at the end of the book of Revelation. So it's not intended to be strictly chronological. There is some general chronology, but not in any detailed way. And so here, chapter 15 begins with a new set of events, a new sign, John calls it. Signs point to something. Signs are witnesses. Signs are indicators of some meaningful event. And here, this sign in heaven, great and marvelous, shows 7 angels who have 7 plagues, which are the last ones, because in them the wrath of God is finished, or with them the wrath of God is finished. So John is really big on the wrath of God. His motivation for doing so is to encourage the readers, and I think we just have to keep going back to that. Who are these original readers? The people in the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3. He's very concerned about them, that they remain in allegiance to Christ and not to ally themselves with the beast, that is the Roman Empire, and the demonic power that John sees behind the Roman Empire. And John will use whatever means it takes to warn his readers that they better be on the right side. We used to have that old hymn, "Who is on the Lord's side?" And it was a more positive hymn than the book of Revelation's use of that idea. But you're going to be on somebody's side. You won't be neutral. In the book of Revelation, you're either on the side of the beast and the Antichrist and the devil, or you're on the side of God and Christ and the church, or the believing community. And there's no neutral ground. And yet some in the 7 churches wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to compromise with the empire and yet still consider themselves as followers of Jesus. And John thinks that's just not going to be possible, that there will come a time when you have to choose, and the consequences of choosing the beast and the empire is the wrath of God. And so he uses the wrath of God as a motivation to keep the believers faithful. All right, let's go on with 15. And I saw another sign in heaven, and we see these angels with 7 plagues, and with these 7 plagues the wrath of God is finished. And I saw, now he's still looking up into the heavenly realm here, into the throne room scene where we have God's presence and the throne and the glassy sea. And here he says, I saw as it were a sea of glass mixed with fire. So we've seen the glassy sea before in presentations of the divine throne room. Here, though, it talks about the glassy sea as mixed with fire, and fire is a sign of judgment, just as we saw the angel that was in charge of fire giving the instructions to reap the clusters of grapes that went into the winepress of God's wrath. And so here, this glassy sea is mixed with fire, and he also sees those who had come off victorious from the beast and from his image and from the number of his name, and they are standing on the sea of glass holding the harps of God. So those who are victorious are those who have overcome the powers of evil. And we know that in the letters to the 7 churches, they were encouraged to be overcomers because Christ had overcome. And in other of the celebration songs that we've seen earlier in the book of Revelation, people have been praised and blessed and honored for having overcome, that is, having been faithful to their witness to God and to Christ against the opposition of the forces of evil, in the person mostly of the Roman Empire. And so those who had been victorious are there in the heavenly throne room at the glassy sea, holding harps, which they will use to accompany themselves as they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. So here we have Exodus terminology, Exodus allusions. You could go back to the book of Exodus and find that when Israel and the people of Israel, led by Moses and Joshua and others, had crossed the Red Sea. And the Red Sea had closed over the enemies, the Egyptians, who were chasing them to kill them. And the Red Sea closed over them, and they were destroyed. Moses and the people of God sang a song of liberation, a song of victory, a song of redemption, and celebration of God's victory, which he provided for them over the Egyptians at the Red Sea, the Song of Moses. This song appears, though, to be drawn not just from the song that people sang, which you can see in Exodus, but from many places in the Old Testament where people sing God's praises. And it's probably best to see the phrases of this song as drawn from throughout the Old Testament. Remember, there was yet no New Testament when this book was written, with the book of Revelation. That got collected later in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, and eventually canonized in the late 4th century to have the New Testament as we have it today. But using the Bible that they had, which was what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the phrases of the Song of the Lamb here are drawn from throughout the Old Testament. And so they sing, "Great and marvelous are your works, O Lord God the Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways." So people are praising God for the greatness of what God has done, and for the justice, the righteousness, the truth of the way God does things. And so God is praised for the great and marvelous works he has done and his works of justice. And he is called the King of the nations, not just the King of Israel, but the King of all the nations, the rightful ruler of the earth. Then verse 4 is a wonderful verse. It's one of these verses of hope in the midst of wrath. And so verse 4 says a question: "Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify thy name?" In other words, it makes sense. It makes sense to only worship God. God is the one who is Lord over all the nations, the creator of the heavens and the earth. Who will not, O Lord, fear and glorify your name? It makes absolutely no sense for anyone to reject the love and forgiveness and mercy and grace of God. And yet the New Testament provides ample evidence that people do and will. And so we have to take these choices people make seriously. And John certainly takes them seriously and wants his readers to do the same. "Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy." That is, there's only one God, the only God worth calling holy, and that's not the Roman emperor, and that's not Zeus or Janus or any of the gods goddesses of the Roman Empire. God alone is holy, and the promise is that all the nations will come and worship before you. So God in the end is going to win, and he's going to win universally, and all the nations will come and worship before God, because it only makes sense. John is saying, who won't worship you, since given who you are and what you have done? All the nations will come and worship before you, because your just and righteous acts have been revealed. So when people truly see who God is and what God has done for us, John's hope is that all the nations will come and glorify God, honor God's name, and worship him. That's the end of verse 4, a verse of hope. But then, verse 5, "After these things I looked, and the temple of the tabernacle of testimony," that is the temple that is like a tent or the tabernacle in heaven. John, like many in the even before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed 20 years or more earlier in 70 AD by the Romans, The Essenes, for example, thought that what was going on in the temple in Jerusalem was illegitimate, not right, not the way God wanted it to be, and they rejected that temple. The book of Hebrews never refers to the temple, always to the tabernacle, which was God's ideal place of mobile worship in the Old Testament, the tent of meeting, which moved around with the Israelites in the wilderness. And so this temple in heaven is really the tabernacle of testimony in heaven. And that temple was opened, and the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues march out. You could almost see them filing out in John's vision of the temple, clothed in bright linen. They are clothed as if they were priests, and they are girded about. They have a sash across their chests that was golden, just like the Son of Man had a golden sash across his bright raiment when he was described, I think, in chapter 1 of Revelation. And so these priest-like angels file out of the temple, the tabernacle in heaven, carrying in their hands the 7 bowls, the 7 golden bowls, which are handed to them by one of the beasts. And verse 7, and one of the 4 living creatures. Now these are not the beasts of the land and the sea who are allies of the dragon, the devil. This is one of the 4 living creatures. It doesn't tell us which one. They were described earlier in Revelation. And one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels the 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. So they receive these 7 bowls, and these bowls of wrath are going to be poured out in chapter 16, our next chapter. So we'll just really look forward to seeing what these 7 bowls of wrath have to do with the earth and with the people who are subject to the wrath of God, who have refused to glorify and honor God as God is worthy. And so the temple then, once this happened and the 7 bowls of the wrath of God were given to the 7 angels, the temple was filled with smoke from the glory and power of God. So much so that no one was able to go back into the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels had been completed. And so the smoke filled the temple. Incense was burned there. Sacrificial offerings were burned there in the temple. When Solomon dedicated the temple back in 1 Kings, the temple there, this temple of Solomon, which was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians, who became the archetype for the evil enemies of the people of God. And of course, John has already announced that Babylon has fallen, this Babylon that stands for the Roman Empire. Here in 1 Kings, the smoke filled the temple so that people could see and experience in some olfactory way, in some auditory and visible way, the glory of God filling the temple as the smoke filled the temple. And so it does here, and in fact so much so that the angels can't go back in. They have to carry out the wrath of God, which we will see carried out in chapter 16. Well, that's my take on the end of 14, a positive word of harvest and a negative word of harvest. And then in chapter 15, the positive hope that all the nations will come and worship before God, and that people won't need the wrath of God to punish them for their disobedience, because they will obey. They will come and worship and serve God. So just keep in mind that John plays this back and forth, the positive and the negative reinforcement or motivation, aimed at his readers, whom he wants to make the right choice in this time of persecution and oppression by the Roman Empire. He wants them to choose the right side, to be on the Lord's side. and not to choose the side of the evil Roman Empire and the powers of evil that are behind it. All right, so much for for Revelation chapter 14, verse 14 through chapter 15, and we'll take up study questions. I will send you study questions later in the week. Michelle and I are actually going to Seattle for a couple of days, and then we'll be back on Wednesday, and I'll try to get study questions out on Wednesday for chapter 16, the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. All right, take care. God bless.